Today is June 26th, International Day in support of the victims of torture. And we're very pleased that you're here today, as people are all across the country and all across the world, calling for accountability for U.S. torture. We're here because we cannot accept that impunity for torture has become the policy of the United States. We're here because we can't accept what the CIA did, as just one example, to Majid Khan, who was a legal U.S. resident, went to high school in Baltimore. In 2003, after he was abducted in Pakistan, Majid Khan was waterboarded twice by the CIA and sexually assaulted while he was hung naked from the ceiling. He was submerged in tubs of ice water until he thought he'd drown. Majid Khan was anally raped when his lunch tray, which was hummus, pasta with sauce, raisins, and nuts, was quote-unquote pureed and then rectally infused. He was threatened with hammering his head, and he was threatened with harm to his young sister. He engaged in self-harm. He attempted to cut his wrists, and he bit into the inside of his elbow trying to sever a vein. All of this we learned from the Senate torture report in December, and then also from Mr. Khan's own testimony to his attorneys. We have several speakers today as part of the national campaign for the United States Justice Department to read the torture report. The first one is Professor Deborah Weissman, who's a professor of law at UNC School of Law. So I welcome Deborah to come up and give us a few words about federal obligations with regard to torture.
We call on the Department of Justice.
As close as possible to you.
We call on the Department of Justice and the Attorney General Loretta Lynch to read the torture report, to fully acknowledge having read the torture report, and to take action to hold the perpetrators responsible and to provide relief to the victims of torture. And in support of that call for action, I'd like to make the following statement. It's incontrovertible that the federal government is responsible for acts of torture, and as a result, we're obligated to hold perpetrators of such violations accountable for their actions. We're obligated, moreover, to address the needs of victims of torture and to offer apology and reparations. The federal government, in fact, has said as much. It has agreed to abide by the Convention Against Torture, having signed and ratified this important human rights treaty, which prohibits torture without any exception under any circumstances. Indeed, this past November, during the recent periodic review process with the Committee on Torture, representatives of our government proclaimed that it is deeply committed to preventing violations of the prohibition against torture, to pursuing justice on behalf of victims, and to denying perpetrators safe haven in its country. Acting U.S. Legal Advisor Mary McLeod, in her opening statements to the Treaty Oversight Committee, stated, "In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, we regrettably did not always live up to our own values, including those reflected in the Torture Convention. And as President Obama has acknowledged, we crossed the line, and he said we take responsibility for that." McLeod, responding to the committee's questions whether the U.S. considered the prohibition on torture and cruel treatment unequivocal, stated, "Unequivocally, yes. Just last month, the United States gave similar reassurances about its commitment to treating detainees in a manner that complied with its human rights treaty obligations. Of course, it's not only human rights treaties that require the United States to refrain from acts of torture and provide remedy to those who've suffered from such acts, although if it were just those treaties, it would be enough. But our own domestic laws have long prohibited such acts, as noted just this week by the American Bar Association in its letter to Attorney General Lynch calling for accountability, not to mention basic civilized decency. Yet the government continues to avoid accountability for its role in the torture program, notwithstanding the release of the Senate report on torture, which revealed acts of brutality far beyond that which we imagined, a program out of control and without adequate oversight. And yet, the Department of Justice claims to have not read the report. Beyond the obvious, what is so troubling is that the rest of the world has. It has read it, and it is urging accountability. The Senate report has significantly undermined the global standing of the United States and has diminished its credibility with regard to all matters pertaining to human rights. Without taking the next steps to hold perpetrators accountable, the United States risks losing further the ability to provide leadership on moral and legal matters. State Department Secretary Tom Malinowski recently stated, "The test for any nation committed to the Torture Convention and to the rule of law is not whether it ever makes mistakes, but whether and how it corrects them." If this administration wants to move forward, which appears to be the catchword, then consider this. The individuals who were tortured do not only suffer in the past, they suffer in the present, and they will continue to suffer in the future. So moving forward requires alleviating their pain in the future. The Department of Justice has an obligation to address the issue of torture. Thus, we call on Loretta Lynch to acknowledge the report, to read it, and to act to hold perpetrators accountable, and to provide reparations for its victims.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Next, we'll have Jane Hunt. Jane is a leader of Amnesty International Group 213, and she'll talk about the national campaign to get the Justice Department to read the report.
Close as possible. Really, really close.
Closer even. Yeah, there. Okay. My name is Jane Hunt, and I am speaking as an individual and also as a representative of Amnesty Group 213, which is based here in Raleigh. The America I believe in does not torture, yet we now have a 6,700-page report which details the tortures committed by our government. Torture which would appall and ashame any informed person. Those who ordered and committed this torture, the enforced disappearances, and other human rights violations in the CIA secret detention program have enjoyed impunity. This makes a mockery of our justice system. The report also contains information about violations of federal and international law. Our government has the duty to investigate and hold those responsible for these crimes accountable, and that should include the involvement of those in North Carolina who have participated in a program of rendition. To not hold torturers accountable is to accept torture as American policy. Amnesty International is calling on the United States to adhere to its own professed values and help strengthen, instead of weaken, international compliance with universal standards of human rights.
Thank you very much, Jane. Next, we'll have Shafia Mbalia, who is a leader of the movement to end racism and Islamophobia, and she'll be addressing the connections between anti-Muslim attacks and bias, racism, and the acceptance of torture by Americans.
Thank you. First of all, we'd like to say that we are Black Workers for Justice. We are in solidarity with the movement to end the torture and renditions that are going on, executed by the United States government against various so-called suspects around the world. We also liken them and see the significance of the same kinds of actions and similar actions going on with prisoners who are in the United States. We recognize something that is developing that some have begun to call execution by medical neglect. There are numerous prisoners who have been held for decades in the United States in solitary confinement for their political views. There are numerous prisoners who have been held in jail solely for their political views, and medical treatment has been withheld. Some of these prisoners have been there long after their sentences have been served. It's very similar to Guantanamo. Some of these prisoners have come from our international, and some are come from the movements, the Chicano, the Native American, the African American struggles of liberation from the 1960s and the 1970s. We cite Afia Siddiqui, a Pakistani prisoner, a woman, a mother who was taken from her children and put into rendition. We cite Rat Brown, also known now as Jamil El-Amin, who was held for 12 years in solitary confinement and is now in general population. We cite Albert Woodfox, who the state of Louisiana is still protesting his being released, who was held for 43 years in solitary confinement, 43 years in a 9x12 box. We cite Maumin Kabir. We cite a number of other prisoners who have been in the jails for all of these years, and we call on the United States government to use its own standards to apply when it talks about human rights, the same standards that they apply to every other country. We say that Islamophobia is something that is rising up in this country, has risen up in this country, and it has been supported, and justified by media, even though the official policy is says that it is not against the Islam or Muslims or Islam in general. However, the political climate in the country has been promoted through constant uses of insinuations, picking up people who are guilty of having thought crimes. To think is not a crime. Many of these people have been set up even before their supposed action. We cite also, for example, Newburgh, New York, where NYPD went into a mosque and set up parishioners, gave them weapons, set up the whole sting, and then accused them and arrested them. It was found to be outrageous even in U.S. courts. And so the Black Workers for Justice, we are standing with this movement. We call for the United States government to uphold its own rules, its own laws, to stop the silent snatching of people, whisking them away from their families in the dead of night, moving them all around the world. We call on the United States government to stop torturing around the world. We call on the United States government to end the solitary confinement. We call on the United States government to end execution by medical neglect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shafia. The same acceptance of torture that Americans have hitherto displayed, torture carried out in their names by dehumanizing Muslim detainees, is the same dehumanization that leads people to carry out crimes like Dylan Roof's crime against people in Charleston recently. It's the turning of people into the other, into the less than human, and we cry out against that and call for all Americans to recognize the humanity of those who are being tortured and kept in solitary confinement, as well as being murdered in cold blood. Next, Joan Walsh from North Carolina Stop Torture Now will speak to our efforts to meet with a representative of the U.S. Justice Department about reading the torture report.
Hi. I took it upon myself to try to set up a meeting with the U.S. Attorney Walker, whose office is in this building. And I called his scheduler. I was put through to his scheduler, left a message asking for a meeting within the next week or two. She called me back the very same day, very nice, and said that his schedule was booked out about 3 weeks, and could we meet with him in July? This initial call took place early in June. So I called back after talking to some of us, and she gave me, we spoke a second time, and she gave me a list of dates that he could meet with us in July. And so I wrote to all of us who wanted to meet with him, and they told me when they could meet with him, and I had assembled a certain number of times, days and times that we could meet. And I started calling back to actually set up the meeting. And this was just a couple of days after the second time I'd spoken with her. And I called and left messages 4 different times on 4 different days, and one after the other, and began to ask urgently that she would please get back to me so that we could set this up before his schedule got booked up again through July. And I never heard back. We did not receive a message back. So, that could be for any number of reasons, but it was rather frustrating. This morning, 3 of us went into the building and brought with us a copy of the 500 and some page summary of the torture report. And our only request was that we be allowed to drop it off at the U.S. Attorney's office. And, they took our IDs, we were screened in that way, and they called upstairs, and no one would come down, even, never mind to meet with us, even to take the report from us. So we elected not to leave it because we didn't know whether it would even make it to the U.S. Attorney's office. So that's the sad story of that. Thank you.
And we are still hoping to meet with U.S. Attorney Thomas Walker for the Eastern District of North Carolina. And people today are also calling the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of North Carolina to urge her boss, U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch, to read the torture report. Our last speaker today, Reverend Doug Long from the North Carolina Council of Churches and their Peace Committee. Reverend Long will be talking about the perspective of people of faith on accountability for torture.
Thank you, Christina. I do come representing people of faith who say that there is no room for torture in a civilized society. In my tradition, I'm used to speaking in 20-minute increments. I'll try not to do that right now. There's a story about a country preacher who was very successful in his communication, and someone asked him what his rule for success was. He said, well, first I tell him what I'm going to say, and then I say it, and then I tell him what I said. So I'm going to tell you what I would say if I were preaching this morning. My text would be, do unto others as you would have it done to you. That's something that in my tradition we know of from Jesus, but it's not just a Christian tradition. It comes from Hillel, the great Jewish scholar and scribe at about the time Jesus was born, who said, what is hateful to you, do not to your neighbor. It comes from ancient Egypt, a papyrus that reads, that which you hate to be done to you, do not to another. It comes from Buddhists who say, treat not others in ways that you yourself would find hurtful. Or Muslims who say, not one of you truly believes until you wish for others what you wish for yourself. It comes from Hindi who say, this is the sum of duty. Do not do to others what would cause pain if done to you. So the question is, if this comes from so many traditions, so many people of faith, why is it that our leaders will not even pick up this report that was prepared by the Senate Select Committee, a report that gleaned from 6 million texts and interviews, whittled it down to 6,000 pages, and of those 6,000 pages, a 500-page summary was written very easily to be seen by all. Why wouldn't our officials want to see this report? because they know already what it says. They know, as Christina said at the beginning of this conference, that it includes accounts of 5 CIA detainees subjected to rectal rehydration. They know that it includes an account where at least one prisoner died during interrogation and there were no repercussions. They know that it includes accounts of one detainee who was subjected to ice water baths and 66 hours of standing sleep deprivation. He was later released because his identity had been mistaken. They know these things, and they know if they read the report, they will not sleep very well at night. And that is not ignorance is bliss. That is cowardice. Margaret Mead, the famous anthropologist, was once asked what she felt like, or what she saw as the earliest sign of civilization. And the reporter thought that she would point to a piece of pottery or a shard of something that was made. And she said the earliest sign of civilization was a healed femur, the largest bone in our body, the leg bone. A healed femur, because in order for that femur to heal, it means that someone had to care for that person while that leg was broken. Otherwise, they would have died, and it never would have healed. I wonder what our society will be judged by hundreds of years from now when they say, was that a civilized society? I stand here with all people of faith today saying there is no room for torture in a civilized society.